You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, there's a lot of talk about the military and civilian divide these days. Actually, there's a lot of talk about it for a long time. I recently learned that General McClellan snubbed Abraham Lincoln and left him in his living room as he went to bed, which is a bit odd. But the problem with a divide between military and civilian leaders in wartime is who directs the war and how is a war given direction? Now, we've heard about this mythical beast called strategy, but what does that mean? Well, listeners, as you can probably guess, I can't tell you, but I may have found someone who can. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. Yes, we've been away for a little bit, but that's because we had some technical issues, mainly because I'm not good at the technical stuff, and my co-producer doesn't really like to teach me too much of the dark art. But we've reviewed our equipment, and hopefully the sound quality on this is coming at you at a better speed and less of a crackling pop, which is what some of you listeners described it as. Thanks very much for all your support on iTunes and around the charts. I can report that we are 125th in Guatemala on the iTunes podcast charts. I'm not really sure why, but hey, it's good to have you Guatemalans with us. Now, my guest today is Sir Hew Strachan. He's a Scottish military historian, and he's currently the Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews. Since May 2014, he has been the Lord Lieutenant of Tweeddale. Before moving to St Andrews, Professor Strachan was the Chichili Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford. Now, his recent books, which are, I'm going to be a really good guest here and say that I own 3 of these 4, include The First World War, Volume 1, To Arms, got me through some exams last year. The First World War, An Illustrated History. Now, that got some of my mates through the same exams last year. Clausewitz's On War, a biography. That is a book I can't recommend highly enough. It's one I use, and it's one that if people ask me about On War, I give them that book first rather than let them slog through books 2 to 7 without any guidance. And finally, the topic of today, The Direction of War, which again helped me out in quite a few exams. So Hew, thanks for coming on the show and helping me out in my exams.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all those nice words about my books. Author's always grateful for that.
Now, so Hew, before we start discussing your book, let's talk about how you found yourself in the business of trying to understand the nature and character of war. What motivated you to become a historian?
That question asks for a 2-part answer. The first is, why did I become a military historian? And that takes me right back to my nerdish youth when, unlike most of my contemporaries in the 1960s, I was more interested in military history than I was in the Rolling Stones or whatever else I should have been doing. As a result, my parents looked at me and said, this guy's taking this subject seriously. They were very supportive. I lived in Edinburgh, and there was what is now the National War Museum of Scotland there. So I was introduced to its collections and its library. And I suppose it's also important to recognise that my father was of the generation that has served in the Second World War. So he and all his contemporaries had a military background. It was there around me as I was growing up. And we tended to play soldiers more than we played cowboys and Indians, I suppose. So what was essentially a childhood preoccupation, somewhat bizarrely and not by any direct route, although people might imagine it might be by a direct route, has become my profession.
That's quite fortuitous.
Well, it was, these things, I did try other things. I indeed briefly worked for my father, who was in shipping. But I became increasingly clear as I did so that I wanted to be a military historian. But you asked about the nature and character of war specifically, and that's the second part of the answer, because the direction of war really came very specifically out of my being at Oxford. I was appointed to that chair in 2001, and it just coincided, obviously, with the aftermath of 9/11, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as a result, the whole of my tenure was captured, really, by those two conflicts in particular, and by the realization that the nature of war may have some continuity and similarity across time. But when I was talking to returning officers, which we did a lot at Oxford, we ran a series of seminars on current developments in Iraq and Afghanistan, I realized how the character of the war in each case was changing the whole time. So every time somebody came back from a tour and they came to Oxford to speak, I sort of saw up in front of me directly how they, particularly if they had done a previous tour, themselves were reflecting the changing character of war. And we had a program at Oxford specifically directed to that topic. So there was an intellectual focus to that. So it was really the extraordinary good luck at one level, bad luck at another, because I was actually meant to be working on the First World War. Good luck in that I found myself engaged in current conflict and trying to understand it.
And talking about your book and not mentioning the fact that you avoided the Rolling Stones, got out of the shipping business quite quickly and found yourself at Oxford, which is a very common career path for most people. The direction was an examination of contemporary history through a historical lens, and you talk a little bit about how the nature and character of war and the changing character of war, particularly I think it's the CCW program that's still running at the moment, influenced your thinking about this. What were you aiming to bring to the reader's attention in writing The Direction of War?
What I wanted to do was to try and unscramble what was new about the experience of conflict in the early 21st century and what would have been familiar or was not necessarily to be regarded as particularly new. There's a tendency, I think, naturally, in anybody who's wearing uniform to elevate their own experience of conflict, of battle, of combat. I mean, that's a pretty intense thing to go through. And naturally enough, when you've done it, I haven't had that opportunity, so I can't speak from experience here. But naturally, when you've been in something as intense as a war, then you want to make that the center of your understanding of war. You will make that for entirely different reasons. So what's the function of the academic here, given the fact that the academic doesn't get to do any of this? And the short answer, it seems to me, is to provide context, to help somebody who's been through that experience understand what might be familiar, and by virtue of understanding what might be familiar, better to understand what is genuinely new. Because everything's new for you when you're in combat for the first time.
Yeah.
But what is it your predecessors would have understood and recognized? And what is it that you're confronting that is distinctive and is something that we need to capture if we're trying to understand war more generally? I mean, that I think is what I'm trying to do here.
And in your book, as part of this, you discuss the meaning of strategy throughout history, which seems it's had a bit of a changeable meaning as well. Are you able to provide our listeners with a modern definition of strategy and its relation to war?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we all struggle with definitions of strategy is that strategy has been used in so many contexts and so diversely that it has been robbed of meaning for many people. And your strategy may not be my strategy, and certainly the sense in which we're understanding strategy, which is within a military context, will not be the sense in which some other people are understanding strategy when they're talking about government policy more broadly, say. I think what we need to do when we're thinking about strategy is, first of all, be clear that it comes within a military context. I'm in favor of a tight definition.
Yeah.
It is to do with war. It may not actually be to do with fighting a war. You may be threatening a war rather than fighting it, but it certainly has war or the threat of war and the violence that contains at its heart.
Yeah.
So very loosely, it probably is about the relationship between war and policy. But as I say that, of course, I use a phrase that so many people associate with Clausewitz's On War, that he talks about the relationship between war and policy. But his understanding of strategy, when he used the word, was very different. His understanding of strategy, he said, was the use of the battle for the purposes of the war.
Yeah.
And he was very consistent about that. So what he meant was something that is much more narrowly military. He wasn't bringing policy into the equation at that juncture. he was understanding what he saw as the business of the general, the need to realize that once you fought an action, you need to think how you're going to use it, how you're going to profit from it, how you're going to exploit it. And that is a function primarily of the guy wearing the uniform rather than the guy who's not wearing the uniform. We can overdo that distinction when we're talking about Clausewitz, just because the distinction was nothing like as clear-cut as it is for us in modern democracies. After all, he grew up in Prussia, which was an autocracy, where the king combined military and civil authority, and where actually the move from one to the other is not as dramatic a move as it would be for us today. So I think for him, in a way, it was easier to gloss over the military-civil distinction. But he certainly understood the distinction between war and policy and the need for a relationship between the two. We, as I say, might now call that strategy. He did not. And I just say that as a cautionary word, because when you pick up on war, if you're reading Clausewitz's On War and he uses the word strategy, do remember he doesn't mean what you might necessarily mean today.
Yes, and our listeners tend to pick up a copy of On War weekly, or at least I hope they do. Probably, well, in Australia, it's actually really good to squash spiders with. So for our Aussie listeners out there, there's a good use of Big Carl's work. Now, looking at the title of the book, it seems to this humble podcast host, and I'm the most humble there is out there, the strategy is essentially, it is a key part of the direction of war, or at least it should be. With the introduction of the different levels of war, we talk about tactical, operational, the strategic level of war, and the increasing reliance on technology, where does strategy fit in on the modern battlefield? Is it in the battlefield? Is it in the cabinet meeting?
Well, it has a potential role in both on the battlefield and in the cabinet meeting. And I think it depends too on the character, dare I say it, of the war in which you're engaged. So if you're thinking, for example, of Australia's recent experience in Afghanistan, in many ways, the strategy is right there on the ground, because the political element of what you're doing in Uruzgan, for example, is much more immediate than if you were fighting in a core level battle in the Second World War. Your role as even a mid-ranking or even a senior officer would be much more clearly defined in professional military terms. In a counterinsurgency, or even in an insurgency, if you happen to be the insurgent, what you're doing has a direct impact on the population and has a directly political effect at every level. It doesn't mean that I'm talking about corporals having strategic responsibility, but it does mean that what the corporal does is potentially full of political consequences, particularly if the corporal gets it wrong. If something goes badly wrong, that can escalate very quickly. What a corporal did in the middle of the Second World War would not figure at a strategic level. So it fits on the battlefield in every circumstance, but it's particularly evident in the context of counterinsurgency. I think in major war, ultimately, of course, what you're doing on the battlefield has to fit into what you think the strategic intention of your side, your country, your coalition is. But it's sufficiently far removed that it's probably not going to have that immediate effect that it will have in counterinsurgency. I think it's also important to distinguish between, particularly when we move to the cabinet level, between strategy and the strategic plan. Natural thing for people with staff college education, people in the armed forces operating at more senior levels, is to think in terms of developing a plan. But at the same time, of course, an old truism, the plan doesn't survive contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
Strategy is also about improvisation as well as about planning. And strategy is how you deal with the situation in front of you, and at the same time, try to make the events fit into what you hope to achieve in the long term, or alternatively, to recognize that you're not going to achieve what you want to achieve in the long term, and you're going to have to change the plan and think differently. So there's a constant dialogue, if you like, going on between the immediacy of what is in front of you and the future of what you intend. And I think in some ways, one of our problems with strategy in the context of wars like Iraq and Afghanistan is we've got too hung up on the plan and on the long-term intention and insufficiently responsive to what's actually happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And that's particularly difficult when you get to the cabinet level, because the politicians will say, this is the plan, and adopt the plan. It may well be a plan drawn up by soldiers, but having got a plan, they've made a public declaration. They don't like to be able to say, well, actually, we're going to have to change it, modify it, go in a different direction because the situation has changed. So you think how much of the vocabulary associated with the global war on terror, for example, continued long past the point at which that vocabulary was really very helpful, because there's too much political buy-in into it. I'm not saying that conducting the global war on terror was itself a plan, but it provided the framework, the narrative within which people were encouraged to understand the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think there's I suppose what I'm saying in part too is how things change over time. What's immediate? What do you have to deal with right now? Which particularly in warfare at its highest intensity, and that can include obviously being on the ground as a platoon commander or as a company commander, as much as being in cabinet, what you have to do immediately and how that relates to where you might be next year or indeed the year after.
It sort of seems that a lot of this relates also to another one of the great maxims from Big Carl's book about understanding the type of war that you're in, as opposed to necessarily the type of war that you may want, which hopefully our listeners are quite familiar with that phrase. And if you're not, read Clausewitz's On War, a biography, because there's a little bit in there about it. But we've got to get to the penultimate question. I like saying penultimate because for some of my more obtuse listeners, it makes me sound really smart. But this relates to strategy, the direction of war, the roles of leaders, and we talked a little bit about this with, autocratic leaders, where with an autocratic leader, I certainly hope there's no civilian and military divide, because that would mean something very disastrous for the mental health of that autocrat. But how and where, in terms of governmental and military levels, should a strategy of war be formulated and executed?
That comes back to your question about what happens in cabinet and how does it understand strategy. And I think we have got ourselves locked into an understanding of civil-military relations and the making of strategy, which simply doesn't reflect where we need to be. And it's partly because after the Second World War, the United States confronted a very new situation in its history, and it had an enormous defense capability and no war to fight. I mean, it's exaggeration. Clearly, it fought wars in Korea, Vietnam, and so on. But the concern was that this defense capability really matched the needs of major war, and that as a result, the armed forces would have disproportionate political influence. We're now in a very different situation where we have much smaller armed forces. We are in a situation of almost continuous conflict. And we therefore need a much better integration of the civil and military that the model of civil-military relations developed by the United States in the 1950s allows for. We need a more coherent dialogue because our politicians are not entering the realm of strategy on a continuous basis. The wars are not so important for them that it's the central item of business in the way that it would have been in the Second World War. And at the same time, they themselves are not developing the expertise fully to understand what is going on the ground. And the people who are doing that are the people in uniform. So the people in uniform need to be able to speak more openly and coherently and consistently when they're engaging with politicians. And politicians need to be more humble rather than simply falling back on the argument that I'm the political boss, don't you challenge the orthodoxy about civil-military relations because we're in a democracy. Of course we're in democracies. No soldiers today in any mature democracies are in the business of trying to execute military coups or trying to take over the authority from the government. But what they are in the business of doing is ensuring that there should be robust discussion. We somehow become frightened of robust debate. But actually, we're not going to get very near the truth if we don't have robust debate and recognize that as a virtue rather than a vice.
It's interesting your comment about the dangers of military leaders commenting on strategy and issues that rightly sit within their realm, particularly with some notable retired star-ranked officers in the US find themselves in running press debates with the president of the US at the moment. But we won't go into those because one, I don't need all the trolls to attack the show, and two, I've got another question I need to ask you anyway. So Hugh, my final question is one I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show, to continue the debate about war and to define war in as many ways as possible, kind of like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, did. I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So I ask you, can you please finish the sentence, war is?
War is an act of reciprocity. It takes two sides to have a war, or more than two sides sometimes. That's a Clausewitzian point, self-evidently. But the point is that strategy creates the sense that you're in control of the war. You're not, because war is a dynamic environment where you're only possessor of the tools on one side of that argument, and the enemy has a vote.
That's good. I like that. That's also a lot shorter than some of our other guests have done. So previous guests, listen, take note, reduce your answers, please. Well, thank you, Sir Hew, for your time here today. It was a remarkable definition, both in its brevity but also its uniqueness. We're 68, maybe 69 definitions in now, so each guest finds it a little bit more difficult each time. And what I've actually found is more useful for guests if they haven't heard the previous definitions, because then they don't get spun up on their own wheels. Listeners, you can listen. You can listen to this episode. You can also buy Sir Hew's book through our show notes. You can go and buy any of the books. Clausewitz is On War, a biography, The Direction of War, The First World War, Volume 1, and The First World War, an illustrated history. Sir Hew, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Mick.
And listeners, thanks for your reviews and your support. So for those listeners that don't know, we do have a Patreon account where listeners can support the costs of running the show. And if you do that, you will provide access to yourself to the bonus question we are now asking our guests. And I tell you what, listeners, Sir Hew just gave us a cracker to the bonus question, which I'm not going to tell you what it is because you need to shell out some shekels for me. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.